To the first meeting of the Welsh Church Act Estate Committee since the election. Could I please advise everybody on the call that for the viewers watching at home as well, this meeting is being live streamed and will be recorded for uploading to the council's website. During the meeting, should any member or any officer wish to speak, could you please use the raise your hand function in Teams, please, and then the chairman will invite you to speak. Okay, and if we could limit the use of the chat facility, please, during the meeting so that all discussions take place within the meeting. If there are any issues regarding audio or camera issues, then you can please use your chat facility to do that. But please, could we say on behalf of the chairman that all discussions take place within the meeting? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. And can I say welcome to the first Welsh Church Act meeting after the council, the annual meeting after council. And can I welcome you all to the committee? First item on the agenda is apologies for absence. Do we have any?
I have no apologies, Chair. Thank you.
I think we're all pretty present, which is good. All right. Are we happy for me to sign the minutes of the extraordinary meeting held on the 14th of March?
Yes, I'll move that, Chair.
Would anyone else be able to move that?
Don't know if there's anybody else available, was there?
I don't think so.
No.
All right.
Oh, Howard was there.
Howard, I don't think you were there, Howard. That was the previous, wasn't it? So
was it? Oh, right.
And okay. I don't think I was at the meeting. So I cannot second it, I don't think. Karen?
Chair, can we just accept the minutes, please?
Just accept them.
Just accept them, please.
That's
yes,
fine.
Please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, right, I was looking at the wrong one.
That's fine. Any declarations of interest? Number 3? Nope. All right, now moving on to Welsh Church Act Estate new member induction. The first thing I do before I think we do that, I think if we just go around and introduce ourselves and what we do. Okay, I'm Mark Wilson. I happen to be not just a trustee, but a councillor for the Stanwell ward in Penarth. Pam, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Yes, I'm Pamela Drake. I represent the Castellan ward in Barry.
Thank you. Charles, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
I'm a councillor in Cowbridge.
Thank you very much. Is Janice on the call? Janice, are you on the call?
No, Chair, not that I can see.
Okay, then, fair enough. Howard, do you want to introduce yourself? Howard, can you hear us? Howard, can you hear us, Howard? Seems to have... we go back to you, Howard.
His mic is muted as well.
Howard, can you hear us?
Yes, sorry. Yes, I can now.
Yourself?
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you introduce yourself? What ward do you represent? And
oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. I've only just got sound. I'm beginning to wonder whether I was going deaf or not. Howard Hamilton, I represent Ilted Ward in Barry.
Thank you very much. Mark, can you introduce yourself as well, please?
Yeah, Mark Hooper from Barrack Ward.
Thank you very much. And Michael, do you want to introduce yourself? You're muted, Michael, muted.
Here I am. I'm sorry about that. Yes, I'm Michael Morgan and I represent the Peterson Super Ely Ward. Thank you.
Thank you. Lorna, do you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Lorna Cross, Operational Manager for Property, and I advise the Trust on all things estates and property matters.
Thank you. James, do you want to introduce yourself next?
James Doherty, I'm the Principal Lawyer and advise the Trust on legal matters.
Thank you very much. Gemma, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon. Gemma Jones, Operational Manager for Accountancy, and I pick up the finance side of things.
Okay, and I think we got some guests as well, haven't we? John, Mr. Benjamin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, hope you can hear me. I'm John Benjamin, and James has asked me to speak to you this afternoon about charity trustees' responsibilities and roles.
Okay, thank you. I know we've got quite a few other people on the call as well. Vicky, do you want to introduce yourself, and Debbie as well?
Hi, do you want to go first, Debbie?
I will do. Thanks, Vicky. I'm Debbie Miles. I'm the Monitoring Officer, Head of Legal and Democratic Services, and I'm attending because I'm particularly interested to hear John's presentation. And in case there are any issues arising linked to the Members' Code of Conduct and, of course, the ethics and standards training that I've previously given. So it's just for that part of the agenda.
Hi, and I'm Victoria Davidson, Operational Manager for Legal Services and Deputy Monitoring Officer, and for the same reasons here to listen to John's presentation, but hello to all members. Thanks.
Okay, and I also think we also got a couple of other members. Ian, do you want to introduce yourself? You're a member of the council?
No, I'm just about to speak, love.
Ian, do you want to say something? Ian Buckley, Councillor Buckley?
Sorry, I was just checking it was only one Ian, yeah. Evening all, I'm Ian Buckley. I'm a councillor for Cornerswell Ward in Penarth.
Fine. And Edward or Eddie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm referred to as Eddie, and I'm from Clantrick Major. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I also think we got a couple of Democratic officers, haven't we? So we got Karen and we got Amy.
Yeah. Karen Bowen, Principal Democratic and Scrutiny Services Officer, supporting the meeting today. Thank you, Chair.
And Amy?
Good afternoon, everybody. Amy Rudman. I'm part of Karen's team in Democratic Services.
Thank you. So we've got quite a few. We don't normally have as many people here, but that's quite nice to see such a good turnout, which is excellent. Okay. Perhaps we should have some sort of like numbers of people attend each meeting at the end and who gets the highest for a small meeting. All right, so that's pretty good, isn't it? A little trophy at the end, you never know. Anyway, so let's so number 4, Royal Church Act to state new member introduction to roles and responsibilities. Lorna, do you want to start on that, please?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. As I've previously introduced myself, I'm Lorna Cross, Operational Manager for Property. This is a bit of a joint effort on behalf of the officers that usually advise the Trust from a property, finance and legal perspective. The report that you've got before you and the verbal presentation aims to provide new members and also update for existing members actually of committee with a summary of the Welsh Church Act estate roles and responsibilities specifically from a legal, finance and property perspective, and also to provide trustees with details of the Trust's land holdings. It's a very quick update report because the detail will be in the verbal reports from the individual officers. James Doherty will be introducing, as we've already heard this afternoon, an external consultant in respect of some legal advice with a presentation, and that's coming from a gentleman who's here joining us this afternoon called John Benjamin of MJB Consulting. So without further ado, I think I'll hand over to James initially to kick off with the external presentation and introduce our guest this afternoon, and then we'll come back to Gemma and I just to run through our sections, if that's okay, Chair.
That's fine, thank you.
Hi all, yeah, so further to a meeting we had back in January, it was raised a request for some external training to be provided by a charity law and sort of regulation specialist, and to that end we have got in touch with John Benjamin from MJB Consulting, as Lorna said, who's going to do a training session or presentation for members, just kind of setting out the sort of the rules and regulations of and roles and responsibilities of yourselves as trustees as opposed to as members of the council. So I think I shall hand over to John now, who can introduce himself properly and give you some background, and then we can continue from there. Thanks.
Right, thank you. Well, in a moment, I'm going to attempt to put my PowerPoint presentation up on the screen. I have sharing rights, I think, but rather than distract myself from that, thank you again for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for being here, particularly those who've pitched up especially to hear me. I hope I won't disappoint. What I wanted to do at James's invitation is obviously talk in fairly general terms about the role and responsibilities of charity trustees, and indeed the role and responsibilities of a charity generally. But of course, you're in a fairly well, it's a unique position, but a slightly unusual position in that you have roles by dint of being councillors with the local authority and a particular scheme, in other words, a governing document that exists that is established, the Welsh Church Act Estate, the charity in this case, and that presents some particular sort of nuances that throughout the course of my presentation, talking in fairly general terms about sort of charity law and best practice. I really like it to sort of stimulate a conversation, questions as we go along from both sort of old hands and newer people and James and the other sort of compliance advisors amongst you that I think will help sort of educate me, but more particularly educate you on some of the issues that will come up from time to time as you sort of exercise your powers. So I'm going to now just trying to see what I need to do to put up my file, browse my computer, probably do that. Do that. Good me. I've done this on Zoom many times, but doing it on Teams, if anyone's got any tips.
If you look on the top right hand side where it says share.
Yeah, I've got that.
You got that, you click on there.
Yeah.
All right, and then you see something called screen. Go to screen mode.
Yeah.
Click on there.
Yeah.
And then you should have something come up. That's it.
Right. And then what? Just click on my presentation.
And then you click on whatever you want to find. Yeah, you click on your presentation and it should come up on the screen then.
Everyone seeing that then? Thank you very much. I've learned something today already.
You got it on there now.
Can?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can
That's
see that.
fine.
Okay. So as I say, a general introduction and some headings that we'll go through. But please, chip in at any time and make this, I think, will be a more useful sort of interactive discussion. So I thought to start with, before we get into specifically to the, or more generally to the charity regulatory sort of framework and environment, I just recap, certainly on my understanding, and possibly this may be helpful for others, in very simplistic terms, what I understand is the situation in relation to the Welsh Church Act Estate. As I say, it's governed by a scheme, so the whole sort of setup was established by legislation from 1914, the Welsh Church Act Estate Act, or the Welsh Church Act itself, 1914, governed by a scheme, and a scheme is a form of governing document for charities, something that's approved by the Charity Commission. So to all intents and purposes, that's kind of your constitution or article. And in the scheme, it talks about the assets of the charity, which I think it refers to as the fund, being held on trust actually by the council, by the local authority. So the local authority is the trustee, but it then talks about, obviously, the local authority working through individuals, through councillors, who manage and administer the assets, the fund, by way of a committee. So essentially, my understanding is that all of you as trustees are actually kind of standing in the shoes of the council, which is the trust itself. But essentially, that means that you have the powers and responsibilities of trustees as the real natural persons, as we say, as lawyers, who are actually making the decisions. So the scheme talks about how the assets of the fund are held, who is managing and administering it, and specifically states, if there was any doubt in the matter, that these assets, including the land, must be managed in accordance with charity law. So that's stated very clearly and explicitly. And obviously what follows on in the rest of this presentation is rooted in that very clear explanation in the scheme. And obviously any charity has to apply its assets to the charitable purposes that exist for that charity, and these are actually set out in the schedule to the scheme. As you are probably very familiar, if you've seen the scheme and you can read it, my copy was quite faint, so perhaps it could do with being typed up again. But the charitable purposes are very broad there. They cover many of the charitable purposes for which many charities are set up: relief of poverty, sort of social, helping people in the local community, advancement of religion, education, and so on and so forth. So much so straightforward, a fairly normal setup. What the trustees, or the committee in this case, must particularly have regard to, and again, this will come up in the slides later on when talking more generally about charity trustees, is really the cardinal rule is to act in the best interest of the charity, and we'll examine that a little bit more as we move along. To manage and avoid conflicts of interest, that's always obviously incumbent upon charity trustees, but there may be more scope for that, or the appearance of conflicts in your case because of the dual roles that you have. And also to protect the charity's reputation, which of course acting in the best interest of the charity and managing conflicts will help to do. Charity's reputation, I mean, that's considered a very valuable and important asset for charities, and the Charity Commission is very concerned with this, partly in many cases because the charity will sort of live or die by its reputation, particularly if it's fundraising from the public. You can imagine the impact of things like, as we know, Kids Company, Save the Children. In fact, over the weekend, Macmillan has had a report published about alleged racism and disablist comments that are made. So Amnesty and Oxfam as well are other cases where this has had an impact on the charity and its reputation. So the Charity Commission, which is obviously the regulator, is concerned about this because of the impact on the charities themselves, but also more generally on public confidence in the charity sector. So looking more generally at principles of charity governance, charities obviously, as we know, are very highly regulated, and notwithstanding that high degree of regulation, we have cases like the ones I just mentioned. But the reason for that high degree of regulation is, of course, the assets of a charity are held on trust. The assets of the charity are not obviously for the benefit of the trustees, but they are essentially public money, very often raised from the public and by the public to apply to charitable purposes. And every charity will have an objects clause, objects or purposes are kind of interchangeable, that will set out what it was established to do. In your case, as I say, the schedule sets out quite a lot of different purposes. But in addition to the charitable purposes, the funds, the assets must also be applied to ensure that there is a public benefit. Now, that may sound similar, those two things, charitable purposes and public benefit, but they're somewhat different. You imagine, obviously, something like the advancement of education or relief of poverty or helping the sick. Those are clearly and obviously charitable purposes, and the charitable purposes that are permissible are all set out in legislation. There are sort of 13 different headings of charitable purpose, as I say, things like relief of poverty and so on. But of course, if you were setting up an educational charity and all you were doing was educating your immediate family, then clearly raising money for that would not be charitable. So there has to be a public benefit. There has to be either the general public or a discernible sort of subset of the public that will be beneficiaries, and the services provided by the charity or the benefits provided by the charity have to be accessible to that discernible category of the public. So you can charge for certain services that a charity may provide, but you should also make provision for people who are not able to afford those fees, for example, to be able to access those services. So I mention that particularly in reference to you because, of course, that not only applies to a charity that's perhaps directly delivering services and benefits to the public, but to organisations, charitable foundations or trusts that are grant makers, that are granting funds to partner organisations who are providing services to the public. So what you may have to bear in mind in some of your deliberations when you're thinking about how the assets and the funds of the charity are applied in accordance with your charitable purposes is who are you giving the money to? Now, again, maybe this is not too much of an issue, but as we'll see as we sort of move along, you do need to have, give some thought, do some due diligence to look at the recipients of funds to make sure that you're fulfilling your responsibility to be acting charitably and in the public benefit. And as I say, the whole the raison d'etre behind this and maintaining the charity's reputation is to maintain public confidence in the sector as well as in your particular organisation. So please stop me if there's any questions up to now, but just to sort of quickly sort of set out some of the regulatory environment underpinning some of the points I've just made. Obviously, there's charity legislation, principally at the moment, the Charities Act 2011, and obviously legislation sets out what charities have to do. The Charity Commission being the regulator, Charity Commission of England and Wales, issues guidance, and the guidance talks about what charities must do, and generally the musts are drawn directly from the legislation, and also talk about what charities should do, sort of best practice. As you can imagine, the legislation and indeed the guidance is a very broad brush approach to a sector that includes literally hundreds of thousands of charities of all sizes doing all kinds of things with large infrastructures, multi-million pound, hundreds of millions of pounds of income to little little church hall charities and that kind of thing more locally. So the guidance is just that. It sort of sets out, it gives guidance, it tells people what they must do and how they might approach using a degree of discretion and latitude and good judgment, how they need to approach some of the other issues. There's lots of guidance, which can be found on the Charity Commission website. The one that the Charity Commission always insists that new trustees read is CC3, the Essential Trustee. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today, comes from that because it is very basic, fundamental stuff. But the Charity Commission, when they grant charity status to a new charity, will say, please make sure all the trustees have read this. So whether or not they do, I don't know. I set up lots of charities and I kind of let them fly solo after that. But that is what the charity expect people to have a look at. And it may be, after this session, the sun's out, you go in the garden with a nice cup of tea and a copy of CC3, and you acquaint yourself. So you can at least sort of tick that box and say that you've done what the Charity Commission would expect you to have done. There's also something called the Charity Governance Code. That's not actually developed by the Charity Commission, although they have endorsed it, and charity commissioners and people who work for the Commission have helped develop it. It's not mandatory, and it sets out, again, there's two versions depending on the size of the charity, but it sets out in fairly general terms how charities should be run, again, best practice, as it says there, to help trustees develop high standards of governance. I've again drawn on that for some of the headings that I've got. Next, it talks about leadership, it talks about diversity, it talks about lots of different factors that trustees should ideally be considering, not just for running, the nuts and bolts of running a charity, but also for succession planning and things like that. So I've drawn on what I think are important elements of all of those areas for the next few slides. Now, in addition to obviously the rules that directly relate to charities and the regulators and the regulations, like many organisations, there are other regulators and agencies that are interested in what you do. The Information Commissioner obviously deals with data protection. HMRC, charities obviously have particular status in the tax environment. Probably, again, not something for you so much, I suspect, but tell me if I'm wrong. Obviously, charities very often need to apply for gift aid on donations that are made so that they can increase their income by 25% on gift aidable amounts. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that concept or if you want me to explain it more. But essentially, obviously, a lot of donations are made from income on which income tax has already been paid, and the basic rate of income tax can be reclaimed by a charity if they are registered with gift aid and if the donor completes a gift aid declaration. And then you've got, again, like many organisations, there are other issues like safeguarding, equalities, anti-bullying, whistleblowing that any charity needs to consider, obviously to a greater or lesser extent, depending on what it does. But again, I mention that here because this will apply not only to charities that are in the front line of service delivery, but also organisations, foundations, and trusts and organisations such as yours that are providing funding and support for other activities. So a degree of due diligence, again, is required if you're going to give money to the local scout group to make sure that they have proper safeguarding policies and vetting and DBS and all of that. As I say, if organisations like Amnesty and Macmillan can be caught out on, equalities issues, then, it can happen anywhere with the best will in the world. And that is something that the trustees, if not directly, at least as in their role as trustees overseeing what's going on, need to be mindful of. So the trustees' role in particular, the first point I suppose to make is that bracketed word collectively. All trustees are equally responsible for everything the charity does or doesn't do. So many trustees, charities, I should say, trustee boards will have a chair, they'll have a treasurer, and then, they may or may not have assigned roles to the other trustees. Very often it's the chair, the treasurer, and everyone else. But all of the trustees are equally responsible and potentially liable for what goes on their watch as trustees. So although the treasurer may be responsible for pulling together the accounts or overseeing it or working with the auditors or whatever it may be, and very often the treasurer might be an accountant, so they might be held to a slightly higher standard, all the trustees are still responsible as they would be for safeguarding issues and the other regulatory areas that I mentioned. So as I say, all the trustees are responsible for everything the charity does, and that will include, obviously, very often there's a power, as there is indeed in the scheme, to devolve powers and functions to subcommittees of people who may or may not be trustees, to professional staff, and that's perfectly legitimate and practical. But the buck ultimately stops with the trustees. So they continue to have to provide that oversight, always. Very often, again, with smaller charities, you get trustees that are actually too hands-on and too, they're micromanaging, and that's something that the Trustee Governance Code would advise against. But equally, it's possible, Kids Company was a good example where the trustees are, a little bit too hands-off and not taking seriously their responsibilities for oversight. So, what's considered good practice, and I think in your case, I hope and imagine with the advice that you have in your own sort of feel for your responsibilities, what's normally good practice is at meetings to have various issues such as safeguarding, such as maybe data protection, depending on what the charity is doing, to have them as sort of permanent agenda items that will always come up with a trustee responsible for those things who will submit a report either before or at the meeting, just so that they're always on the agenda. That's considered a good way to do things. And you'd be surprised for people who are not working in the kind of field that you're working in a regulated environment for a local authority, how often that doesn't happen. In fact, how many charity trustees haven't ever seen or aren't familiar with their governing document and don't even really know what their charities are set up to do. So I hope and trust and imagine that you're in a much better place than that. But that's the kind of expectation, obviously, that trustees are expected to meet. So charity has to be run properly, obviously, has to be compliant with the law, has to act in accordance with its governing document and provide a public benefit. And just the red wording there, trustees are those with direction and control of the charity. So even if in your case the local authority is actually the trustee, the individuals who are essentially directing and controlling the charity would be regarded as trustees in this case, or certainly have to adopt the responsibilities that we're talking about today. More specifically, and again, some of these things will come up, and forgive me if it's slightly repetitious, but they will come up several times. So the trustees are obviously responsible for acting in the charity's best interest, which we'll come on to in a moment in a little bit more detail, including protecting its reputation. And as you can imagine, in the context of what we're talking about, the way that the trustees act, given that they do have potentially a dual role as councillors, is something that that may come under scrutiny. Obviously, the trustees are responsible wearing their trustee's hat for assessing and managing the risks facing the charity itself and no other organisation or institution with which they might be connected, and for managing the assets and the liabilities of the charity. Again, without, I won't say without any regard, but certainly without losing sight of the priorities that they have as charity trustees, and more generally for sort of setting the strategy for the charity and planning for the future. So obviously many trustees are involved with the sort of the day-to-day running of the charity, if it's operational, delivering the services, if it's funding or grant making, looking at how to do that. But trustees obviously are also responsible as trustees for ensuring that the charity will continue to be able to operate in accordance with its charitable objects. And that will, again, I suppose in this particular context, involve preserving the assets, making sure that there is a continued flow of income, if that's appropriate for the investment strategy or the way that land and other property is managed. And planning for the future. Now, sometimes, not in this case, I'm sure, but sometimes planning for the future is recognizing when a charity has run its course. Sometimes, charities were set up 50 years ago for a particular purpose. The purpose has been slightly lost sight of, and, there's no longer a need for a tax home in Rotherham or whatever it may be. And, it's the responsible thing would be for the trustees to actually think about winding up the charity, or possibly giving funds to another organisation with similar objects that can more ably fulfil those purposes. So setting strategy and planning for the future can be a long-term future, or indeed looking at the future in a different way and winding things down. So acting in the charity's best interest, the Charities Governance Code, particularly under the leadership section, talks about setting and maintaining the charity's culture, and mentions things like integrity, transparency, oversight, accountability, and compliance. So all fairly obvious things, I would have thought. But again, in the current context, things that probably you would need to keep uppermost in your minds when you're exercising your role as trustees, whilst also obviously being councillors with the local authority. So again, with the guidance of James and others, when you are meeting, when you're making decisions to do so in a very transparent way, clearly managing conflicts, as it mentions there as well, and giving obviously every impression to be doing the right thing and to be seen to be doing the right thing. Again, working as councillors, you're very much in the public spotlight anyway, so I'm sure all of this is second nature, but you have the additional sort of complication, as it were, of having these dual roles. Managing conflicts, again, probably very obvious, I imagine, but there may be instances that have come up that you're aware of that fall into a bit more of a grey area. For charities generally, I mean, there's always something in their governing documents about managing conflicts, and indeed in the charity legislation in the Charities Act 2011 talks about managing conflicts and how to do that. Trustees obviously can't derive a personal benefit. They can't be paid for being trustees. They also can't assume any benefit indirectly, and that may be to a connected person. I put that in inverted commas because it could be a relative, it could be a spouse or child or grandchild, or it could be a company with it which they're connected. So clearly, you know, there are instances you can easily imagine where trustees might be making a decision that could benefit them indirectly or directly personally. And obviously, in your case as councillors, you would bear in mind not only might that be a benefit in sort of financial terms, but in other ways, sort of preferment in some way or advantage at the next election or whatever it may be. So all of that has to be sort of put to one side and declared if that's even a possibility of being you know, perceived conflict of any kind. Some of these conflicts will be known to you all anyway, and charities are normally expected to keep a register of interest. That's something you as councillors probably do anyway. But obviously, some other conflicts will come up as and when particular decisions fall to be discussed. And when that happens, obviously, as well as declaring the conflict, the expectation would be that someone who is conflicted would have to recuse themselves, step back from decisions and vote on the particular issue. I think, you know, depending on the nature of the conflict, very often people say, right, you've got to leave the room, you've got to step out, can't have any involvement. I think if someone has a particular insight or you know, something useful to say to the other trustees, to the committee, about a particular issue, possibly because they are conflicted, they may have some insight. As long as that conflict is declared and known about, I think it actually can sometimes assist the committee and the other trustees to hear from the conflicted person, even if they are not then, as they shouldn't be, involved in any decision making or vote. But again, that's something that the chair of the committee and the other trustees would have to bear in mind as to whether that's an appropriate thing to do. And as well as obviously, you know, as I mentioned before, managing in conflict, all of this goes to reputation, to the way that both the local authority, in your case, as well as the charity is perceived. So there's clearly an even higher bar than if it was just a charity that has the normal kind of conflicts that might come up. So assessing and managing risk, again, really touched on some of this before. Obviously regulatory compliance, legal compliance, but looking at some of the other things either directly or indirectly through your funding partners or recipients of funds, some of the operations they may be involved with, to make sure that they are adhering to same sort of high standards that would be expected of any organisation. Safeguarding kind of gets a mention in its own right because that's really particularly important. But policy development, you know, you might ask, as well as yourself having, you might ask funding partners to produce for your perusal policies on things like equality, whistleblowing, and some of the other things that I mentioned, just to see and assure yourself that they are being run properly and professionally, and that they give those sort of assurances to you. I think the last slide is, again, drawing together some of the themes that come out of the Charity Governance Code about board effectiveness, which may affect you to a greater or lesser extent. What the Charity Governance Code talks about is having trustees with the right skill set. So increasingly, trustees or trustee recruitment is looked at as almost like, you know, recruiting staff. Job descriptions are drawn up. There are interviews. Some charities use agencies, recruitment agencies, to find trustees. But the process is being kind of professionalised and formalised in many cases much more than it was before. Because what you want to do is ideally have trustees who can do particular things for you. As I say, your accountant, the treasurer. You may have someone who's marketing, who's involved in the fundraising side. You may have educators or safeguarding people if that's the area in which you're working. All property people, which again in your case you obviously have council officers to advise on all of that kind of stuff. But you know, the idea is to make sure you have trustees who are not simply time servers, but who can actually fulfil functions, and then have portfolios quite possibly within the trustee board who are responsible for particular things, who will report back on agenda items at every trustee meeting or every other trustee meeting, so that you know that all of these boxes are being ticked and that there is oversight for all the things that you need to keep an eye on. And you know, again, it's just sort of built into the structure of the charity. So assigning suitable roles, giving people portfolios, obviously delegating powers, as I mentioned, is perfectly possible, and in fact your committee is essentially holds delegated powers from the local authority as the trustee itself. And I'm sure not relevant in your case, but an equal commitment of time and effort. Anyone that's been on a sort of any kind of committee, whether it's a charity trust or otherwise, will know that there are the people that do, and there are people that just turn up or possibly don't even turn up to meetings. So obviously, ideally, you want a board of trustees of people who are equally committed, who actually put in the time and have roles that they can report on and perhaps be even appraised on, so that you can see that everyone is pulling their weight and that all the responsibilities are being discharged. And again, coming from the Charity Governance Code, but you know, as in life, these things are self-evident but not always adhered to. An open culture for healthy discussion, people who feel they can speak freely. Again, on a lot of trusts, charity trusts that you see, where particularly where the trustees haven't changed for years, it may be a family trust or something that was set up by someone who's stayed as the chair of trustees for 35 years, and they do bring in new trustees, but everyone's a little bit afraid of the chair and they don't open their mouth. Clearly, you want an environment where people can speak truth to power, although obviously they should be exercising power equally anyway, but where people can speak honestly about the issues that are facing the organisation. And in the same vein, encouraging diversity in every sense. Again, lots of organisations sort of miss what was being fairly obvious, having people who come from the class of beneficiaries that they're helping, and might be people with a disability or whatever, having those people included on their trustee boards, or young people, or people of colour, or whatever it may be. Having that diversity is not only, again, the right thing to do, but it is incredibly healthy and beneficial to the organisation to have those different viewpoints, whether it's from people who are beneficiaries or have certain perceptions and mindsets about particular issues. So that's a general rule that I think is important as well. So that's the last of the slides. If I can now close that down and come back. Doing it right. No. Right. Back in the room.
Thank you very much, John, for that. It was a very interesting presentation on the generic roles of trustees. I just wondered, before I bring in members, I just wondered if any officers, Debbie, do you want to say something first?
Yes, please. And thank you very much, John, for that presentation. And I'm very pleased to say it does sit very comfortably with the training that I've given so far. So that's good news. Just to remind members, and I won't run through the ethics and standards training, I promise, but members will be familiar with regards to the Members' Code of Conduct. There is a provision, paragraph 3B, which provides that members comply with the Code of Conduct, except and insofar as it conflicts with any other lawful obligations to which that other body may be subject, and that is applicable. That's other laws and other lawful obligations. That's where the obligations under trust law sit. The guidance from the Ombudsman in that regard also provides that if you are appointed as a trustee, and reading through from the guidance from the Ombudsman, it provides that you're obliged when acting as such to do so in the best interests of that charity in accordance with charity law and with the guidance which has been produced by the Charity Commission. So it is just recognising knowing that there will be additional responsibilities, additional codes and laws which do apply to the Welsh Church Act Estate Committee, as John has set out. There are a number of synergies with some of the comments that John has made. So members will be appreciative of the fact that, as you're well aware, that if you have a personal interest, that needs to be declared. If you have a prejudicial interest, similarly, that needs to be declared. And so that picks up the point that John made with regards to recusing from decisions and votes. So important to bear in mind. One point just to pick up, I mean, John mentioned that if you've got a personal prejudicial interest, you may still have an insight which would be valuable to share with the other members of the committee, the other trustees, and I certainly agree with that. Within the Vale Council, what certainly I would recommend is that if you find yourself in that situation, to seek a dispensation. So you're all familiar with the process we run with Standards Committee considering dispensation applications. So and you're all familiar that if you have a personal and prejudicial interest, you can seek a dispensation. So if you do, as John has said, feel that you could really contribute to the debate because of your experience or your role in another arena, please do, in advance of the meeting, seek a dispensation from Standards Committee. As you know, they meet every other month, so plenty of opportunity to do that. The other point that I wanted to raise, John talked about connected person, and that has synergies under the Members' Code of Conduct to close personal associate. So you're all familiar with that, and you're all familiar with the guidance from the Ombudsman. But again, also, you know, when you consider the training you've had on the Members' Code of Conduct, there are obligations to act showing respect and consideration, also to carry out your duties and responsibilities with regard to the principle of equality. So everything that John has said is consistent in that regard with the Members' Code of Conduct. Additionally, objectiveness in decision making is really important. Bear that in mind. And also, of course, the issues that we've previously discussed in the ethics and standard training about not being predetermined, albeit you can be predisposed to a matter. And last but not least, having regard to the advice of officers. So, as I say, very happy with the points raised. And as I say, they do reinforce the training that you've had to date.
Okay, thank you. Before I bring James on, John, I know you're still sharing your screen because I can see myself twice. And if you could go up to share and so say stop sharing, that's it there. That's fine. Thank you very much for doing that. All right, James, do you want to say something as well?
You've just said exactly what I was going to say, Mark, at this point. So I've got nothing at this stage. I'll leave for members for now.
That's fine. Okay, open to members. Now, does any member want to bring up any point? You could be as technical or as not technical as possible, because I got a few questions if you don't ask. Charles, do you want to ask a question? Thank you, Charles.
Hopefully it should never happen, but if there's a tortious action against the trust, where does the liability lie, with the council as a trust or the trustees? Good question.
Well, if
James,
I am,
James,
I'm happy
John,
to
answer.
James probably has a better
John.
than I do. I had a very faint copy of the scheme to read, but my understanding is, as I said at the beginning, that the trustee is actually the local authority, and that is obviously a legal entity that could be, could bear liability and be sued in its own right. And trustees normally have a degree of protection unless it's an unincorporated association, because of that, that structure that they are trustees, either directors of a trustee of a charitable company or whatever it may be. So there should be protection there, unless obviously a trustee goes, does something fraudulent, dishonest, and knowingly beyond the pale. But I'm sure James can talk more particularly about the setup.
James, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that there is an aspect. I suppose the only other element would be obviously where individual trustees are kind of driving a particular line of decision making, would be potentially a line of question if that could be found to sort of be to the detriment of the charity, I suppose.
Debbie, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, and just to support what's been said, also, you know, it's picking up that point that I finished on. It's that following the advice of officers. So it's that concern, I suppose, if advice is being given, legal advice, possibly advice being relayed by the legal advisor in consultation with myself, as you know, that is given added weight, and it's if that isn't being followed, I think in those circumstances we could find ourselves in, or members could find themselves in a bit of difficulty there. So it's being mindful of that.
I mean, the thing is, as a former litigation lawyer, you know, you can, even if it's the local authority that should be sued, a litigant, if they got it into their head just to, you know, cause a nuisance, or because they genuinely thought, or their legal advisor thought that they should sue a member individually, that's still a hassle, even if that might be dismissed. You don't want to be in that position. So, you know, there's the nuisance value of litigation as well as the legal veracity of the claim.
Okay, open to any other member. Okay, I think one of the things I like perhaps for you to have a conversation with especially the new members and the existing members is the role between being a councillor and the role of being a trustee. As also, I also want to discuss the other question I was going to ask you is, are we managerial trustees or are we holding trustees as well, and what is the difference?
By holding trustees, you mean having the assets vested in you? Do you mean?
Or holding a lease, or actually not doing the actual. So, I mean, for instance, an unincorporated association which I belong to, nothing to do with this. We have managerial trustees and we have holding trustees.
Okay, so where an unincorporated trust means that there is no legal entity apart from the individuals who are trustees. And if you hold land has to be vested in someone. It can't be vested in an entity that doesn't exist, an unincorporated association. Therefore, you would always find normally a couple of trustees, or better yet, these days, you might have a trustee company, or there's I think it's a public guardian. There are ways in which an organisation can hold, that is not incorporated, but can hold land, other than putting it in the name of two trustees, because obviously there's an issue there that if the trustees change, you've got to go back to the land registry and change it all and all the rest of it. The scheme here, again, if I've read it correctly, and I could make out the very faint type, the scheme here vests certainly the real property, the land, in the local authority. So that is the legal entity that is holding on to the property. So as trustees, you are not personally holding, you know, there's no title vested in your name as individuals.
So correct me if I'm wrong, we're effectively what we call managerial trustees, aren't we? In that sense.
Yeah, I mean that's right. You know, you are acting in the role of trustees because you are the ones with the direction and control of the charity. The local authority obviously is not a real person in legal terms, and operates through the individuals that it appoints. The scheme talks about delegating powers or having a committee to administer and manage the assets of the charity, the fund, and that's what this committee is. So again, technically, the trustee is, as I understand it, the local authority. It's not just the holding trustee for land, it is the local authority. But whether or not that's right, you as the committee are essentially expected to act as trustees in the way that trustees are expected to act.
Okay. James, do you want to say something about the role of a councillor versus the role of a trustee?
Yeah, I think it's just being able to keep that clarity between the conflicting interests that you're going to have just by virtue of the very nature of the appointments that you've got, because it is plausible to have a situation whereby the decision that may be in the best interests of the trust and your role as a trustee may conflict with what may be the most advantageous political position, or maybe where you have a section of the community who are opposed to a particular decision-making process or decision-making outcome, and it's just being able to balance those and understanding your different role in this committee as opposed to your role on other committees of the council, whereby you are in the main acting as a councillor in the best interest of your the electorate and the public at large, whereas this is a slightly different, taking things from a different aspect, I suppose.
Thank you very much. Okay, Lorna, I haven't got any other members. Does anyone want to come in at this moment before we discuss Appendix A and Appendix B? Okay, in that case, Lorna, do you want to come in and talk about Appendix A and Appendix B on this item, please?
Thank you, Chair. If you don't mind, I'll deal with Appendix B first, only because that's the items I've got. I'll be presenting, and then we'll move on to Gemma's item after that, if that's okay with you. So trustees and committee will have before you a summary of the trust's land holdings and indicative site boundaries for each parcel of land. The land capable of being let for income producing activities and uses has been let and continues to be reviewed, and the process is managed through officer delegations in consultation with the chairman. So for instance, annual grazing licenses or biannual grazing licenses that come up for tender, we use officer delegations to manage that process in consultation with the chairman. Any other land issues requiring a decision of committee are brought before committee by way of report, and that usually entails a request for disposal from third parties or acquisition from third parties, any other proprietary interest in land which has an effect on the trust's land holdings are brought before committee. And where such matters are considered, it's a usual practice and something which is good practice to seek a qualified surveyor's report, which is sought and presented to committee before decisions are made in respect of any particular request, certainly for disposal requests. And that's in line with the Charity Commission guidance as well. So just to outline, the trusts would be obliged to act in accordance with the qualified surveyor's report. That's an external report that we seek, just to ensure that sort of external advice and up-to-date sort of expertise is provided to trustees. Unless the trust have any contrary view that they wish to apply directly to the Charity Commission, I think I'm right in saying, James, for an alternative road to what the qualified surveyor's report entails. And just to confirm that the majority of, as I said, that actually most of the land that's capable of being let has been let and is income producing. We do hold quite a few land assets that are incapable of being beneficially let for various reasons, including being landlocked or leftover parcels of land that the trust inherited from a long time ago, which are more of a burden than anything else. I think the chair will agree, and those of you who have been on the committee for a while, we do look at options for management of those difficult parcels of land. So it's something that is discussed at committee quite regularly. So that's pretty much all I had to say. I think that covers what we we do in terms of reporting. But I think it's really important just to state again that, you know, the qualified surveyor's report and recommendations are actually key to the decision-making process, and there has to be a really good reason why the qualified surveyor's report isn't sort of accepted. Again, the trust doesn't have to do anything really in terms of land disposal unless the trust wants to, but obviously if there's an opportunity to look for a better use in terms of value for the land, then, you know, so we're obligated to look at those proposals, and then the trust makes informed decisions based on the advice received.
Thank you very much, Lorna.
Gemma, do you want to discuss Appendix A, which is the financial assistance application investment portfolio?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So I just briefly set out the finances because the next committee meeting will be bringing the accounts, so you'll be able to see the kind of finance position in more detail at that point. But broadly, the kind of main long-term assets of the trust are, we've got about just over 3 million in terms of parcels of land, as Lorna set out in her item, and then about 1.9 million of investments, which are currently being managed on a discretionary basis. And we are going through a process at the moment with support from our investment managers of going out to look at some kind of collective investment funds as a way of trying to generate a bit more investment income for less investment management fees. So in terms of last year's accounts, we generated just short of 18,000 in terms of land rental and just over 31k in terms of investment income. So that's below our kind of targeted investment income. And then that income is then utilised to kind of pay the kind of ongoing costs of the trust. And after an estimate of what those costs will be, we set an amount aside to pay grants out in the year. So the purposes that the grants can be awarded for are very broad. And so we have previously, the committee has previously set some kind of specifications in terms of how we would then go out and award those grants. So for instance, we've said that we would only award to organisations because the broader premises of the scheme allow us to award to individuals, which we thought would be quite problematic to manage. And we've also set an amount of between £100,000 and £5,000. Because we have limited amounts to award, we've also said that we would normally look for a 25% match funding as part of the scheme, and we would only award for one-off schemes. So for a capital scheme or for like a project cost of a scheme. And the sum, I apologise, the incorrect sum is on the appendix, but it's 45,250. So there is a transposition error on the appendix. So those are the kind of highlights of the finances, but I am happy to take any questions. We do, of course, have the first tranche of grant awards coming up later in the week.
I think Charles wants to say something. Charles?
Just very quickly, if you're looking to put funds somewhere, do you need to look at a green or ethical funding?
There is some guidance in the investment part of the charity guidance on the Charity Commission, because we did pick this up as part of a previous committee. So our current investments are on an ethical basis. There is no, in terms of the Charity Committee guidance, as long as the trustees can demonstrate that the charity isn't at a detriment because of going from a kind of ethical basis, then that is fine for trustees to choose to do it on that basis. And there can be other considerations as to why the trustees would want to invest on an ethical basis. So at the moment, we haven't specifically narrowed it down to only ethical schemes, but we have included ethical schemes in our information collection approach. So the kind of long list that we're assembling at the moment contains a mix of ethical schemes and standard schemes. Some of the organisations we're looking at are organisations such as CCLA, so they have a sustainable ethical investment, collective investment fund, and a standard one, albeit the standard investment collective fund is perhaps more ethical than you would find perhaps with some of the other investment organisations. So at the moment we've used a questionnaire to gather long list information, which we will assemble and review on that basis. But certainly, I mean, it's for committee to decide with support from our investment advisors as to whether they want to go forward on an ethical and all the others, the social considerations as well going forward.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any questions for Gemma? Fine. Has anyone got any generic questions on the role and responsibility of being a trustee? I got no one indicating, so I assume that everyone is happy about their role, but we'll find out, won't we? Okay, James, do you want to come in before we finish this item?
Yeah, I was just coming in. I think if we're all completed with the item, just to say thank you to John for his
Absolutely,
time
I was going to do that
today. So I'll let you do that then, Chair.
All right, and can I thank you very much, John? I thought that was a very interesting presentation, and really appreciate you doing that for us. All right, thank you.
A pleasure, and I'm glad I didn't conflict with anything you've been told previously and sow confusion, but added a little bit more light than darkness, one hopes.
Fine, thank you. I think, James, do you want to come in again, or you just got your hand up?
Oh, sorry, legacy hand. Sorry, Mark.
That's all right. Thank you very much, John. Thank you. You're free to stay if you want to, but I'm sure you've probably got other things to do.
Thank you very much. I got a new puppy yesterday, so.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. You need to look after
I was down in Cornwall, so I was a bit south of where you were, but not that close, but nearby.
Okay then.
Yeah,
thank you very much, John. Much appreciated. Thank you. Lovely. All right. I think we just moved. We note that report. Okay. Okay. We're now moving on now to the next item, which is agenda item 5, proposed adoption of land at Seaview Terrace, Barry. Do you want to present this, Lorna and James?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll present this, and hopefully James can add some legal comments if required. So the report is to advise committee of correspondence received from the Vale of Glamorgan Council in respect of a proposal to adopt a portion of roadway in the Trust's ownership at Seaview Terrace in Barry. And the conversation we've just had and the training will come in quite handy here, because obviously this is a matter which has come through from the local authority in obviously as an outside organisation to the Trust. Officers were made aware of a proposal by the Council's Highway Authority in respect of a small portion of land owned by the Trust, and that small parcel of land is shown at Appendix A. The other plan that you have before you at Appendix B is attached only for information, and that just gives a bit of a context in terms of the wider piece of land that the local authority are looking to adopt, and as part of the overall proposal for the land. Officers understand from the local authority that the condition of Seaview Terrace is not great. It's currently unsurfaced and unadopted. The council understands that the unsurfaced roadway currently presents a risk of a potential claim from third-party damages resulting from poor quality of the roadway and the route. The council proposes to upgrade the road, providing a properly constructed highway and resurface, and including land owned by the Trust between number 1 to 5 Seaview Terrace. The council, as a result, wrote to the chair of the Trust outlining their proposal to upgrade Seaview Terrace roadway by laying a new tar macadam carriageway surface over the area identified, and the council's highway team have advised that they'd be carrying out necessary drainage improvement works also to complement the proposed new surface. The council proposes, subject to the agreement of the trust, obviously, and subject to the appointment of a suitable contractor, to commence works to upgrade the road as soon as possible. And officers are advised that the council anticipates that the works will take approximately a week to 10 days to complete. As I said, they plan to commence as soon as possible, but obviously subject to the trust's response today in terms of a resolution one way or another. The council's confirmed that every effort would be made to keep inconvenience to residents and road users to a minimum. However, obviously, due to the nature of the works, there will be some noise and disruption to residents, and I think that's been seen to be inevitable by the very nature of the works. In terms of financial implications, the trust will not be in any detriment as a result of this proposal. All costs associated with the proposal to dedicate the public highway, if approved, will be borne by the council. And in actual fact, you know, future liability and responsibility, if the roadway is adopted, will then fall to the council going forward. In terms of any legal obligations, as the owner of the land, the trust would currently be liable for any claims for injury or damage caused to persons or vehicles due to the condition of the land. And the proposal is that liability would pass to the Highways Authority if the land were to be adopted by the authority. The process of adoption by the Highway Authority would mean that the land would not, without a subsequent extinguishment of the highway rights, be able to be developed or used in any other way other than a highway. And but the adoption would not prevent the trust from disposing of the land at a later date. So for those members who understand the process of disposal applications and the way we treat those, we would normally go for a qualified surveyor's report and seek the advice, but because this is not a disposal, it's a request to adopt the land. There's no requirement for the trust to seek that qualified surveyor's report. So in terms of consideration and recommendation, the trust are just asked to consider the request from the local authority's highway section to formally adopt the land in the trust's ownership, and as I said, the extent of which is shown on the plan at Appendix A. Is there any questions at all?
Yeah, open to any member. Anyone got any questions they want to ask at all? I mean, I personally think it's a win-win. I mean, I don't think there's any real downside to that at all from a perspective of a trustee, and I wish that could happen almost in every piece of land that we have. But I'm, you know, I'd be asking too much, I feel. But I think I'm happy to support it. Are we all happy? And Mark, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I presume this is one of those pieces of land that was described as pretty useless earlier on in the presentation. So, yeah, I think this is a bit of a no-brainer. We should move on and agree this quite quickly, and I'd be happy to propose.
All right, I'm happy to second it because I think I proposed it, but you're happy to second it. Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, are we agreed? Yep, fine. Got thumbs up. That's the important bit. Thank you very much. We're now moving on to the next item on the agenda now. Okay. Sorry. It's agenda item 7, Lamb at Glebe Fields. Okay, Lorna, do you want to introduce this?
I think this will be.
I think this is James, Chair. That's okay.
I think it's a really important bit here. We do a bit of context first, a bit of background. So we introduce what Glebe Fields is, because not everyone will know what it is on the committee.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so this is an update report in respect of a town and village green application that we had in at the end of last year that came forward to committee on the 31st of January, whereby a group in Sully have put in the town and village green application for the Glebe Field, which as for those of you who know Sully, if you were driving through Sully towards Barry is kind of the last field on the left hand side before you get to the roundabout at the end of Hayes Road and Sullymores Road, and it's the field that kind of extends from South Road right down to the coastal footpath adjoining Beechwood College at the end. So to say, we had received an application to register that land as a town and village green. The full content of the application is available on the minutes to the meeting of the 31st of January, which is available on the website if you'd like to look at the full application for those who weren't on committee at the time. Further to that application, we had a recommendation to instruct a barrister to act on behalf of the Welsh Church Act and State Committee to putting forward an objection to the application, to request that the Commons Registration Authority dismiss the application and that it not be registered as a town and village green. So this is an update report to let committee know that we instructed Michael Brett of Francis Taylor Buildings in London to act on the Welsh Church Act Committee's behalf, and an objection was drafted, which is contained at Appendix 1 of the report, setting out the grounds on which the Welsh Church Act as landowner felt that the town and village green application should be dismissed. In summary, those grounds are that the applicant has failed to meet the required legal tests in relation to the land, and those are set out within the objection, and also that there has been what's known as a trigger event on a portion of the land, which is the area of the land to the north of the site abutting South Road, courtesy of a planning application that was submitted by Surrey Centurions Cricket Club back in 2009, I think. The date escapes me. Subsequent to the objection being submitted on behalf of the committee, the applicant has put in a response to that objection. Apologies if anyone can hear any background noise. My children seem to be having an argument. That basically where they responded to aspects of our objection, and amongst those were mainly some legal points. They also queried the position in relation to the planning application referred to being a trigger event by virtue of the fact there were some pre-commencement conditions on the application. Those pre-commencement conditions were discharged, and we've had confirmation of that from the planning department, and the next step will be for us, for me and the barrister, to go back to the applicants further with a response to the response, setting out the points that we would have in relation to those being made by them. So as an overview of kind of the process from here, there would generally be a sort of toing and froing between the parties in an attempt to narrow the issues in dispute in relation to the matter. This will be followed by, so there's one other aspect of the response to the objections drawn to your attention was the point that had been made by the applicant about the council in its role as Commons Registration Authority not being the appropriate person to make a final decision on the application due to the fact that the council in some respects is both the determining body and the landowner as trustee for the trust. To this extent, the applicant suggests the appointment of an independent inspector, which would be an independent barrister who would sit and hear the inquiry into where evidence from both sides is heard and make a final recommendation to the council as to what the formal decision would be. And this is fairly standard practice where council land is involved in town and village green inquiries. So yeah, the next steps then would be the toing and froing of narrowing the issues, followed by probably the appointment of an independent inspector, and then the independent inspector would then set down a timetable up to and including a date for an inquiry to hear all the evidence, following which he would write and submit a report with a recommendation as to whether the application should be approved by the council, dismissed by the council, or potentially approved or dismissed in any part. So that's the nature of the report. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you. And Mark, do you want to say something?
Yeah, do we have to pay the costs of this independent survey, the person who looks at the both reports then?
Not us as a committee. So the council in its role as Commons Registration Authority would appoint the inspector to hear the inquiry, and those costs would be borne by the Central Council Fund rather than the Welsh Church Act Committee Fund.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any other member? I got no one indicating they want to speak on this. Okay. Can we move to the recommendations then, in that case? Okay, recommendation is that we note the content of objection and response to the objection. Okay. And I think that's what we do. Okay, fine.
I would second that, Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, and we now move on. Is anyone else happy with that? Yep, fine. Good. We now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is application for financial assistance, tranche 1. Gemma.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have, based on the estimates of financial expenditure in the year, set a budget of just over £45,000 for grants in year, and that includes £5,000 that we carried over and allocated from 21-22. And we have set out grants in Appendix A totaling just short of £25,000. So if I just run through those, sorry, it's slightly small, so I'll be zooming in myself. So as you'll be aware, we receive grant applications from the Vale of Glamorgan, but also Cardiff Council recommend grant applications to us from their grants team. So we do typically tend to receive more Vale of Glamorgan applications than for Cowbridge. So we've just got the one recommended by Cardiff Council for St Dennis Church in Lisvane. So if I just run through the applications from top to bottom, so we've got one for St Mary's Church in Cowbridge, and that's relating to some church tower repairs. They've requested £5,000, and as this is such a large scheme, £85,000, we're recommending to award a sum in principle. It is contingent on a number of other grant applications that have only just been applied for. So the proposal would be to award in principle pending confirmation by the organisation that the other grant applications have been successful and that the scheme is able to proceed. And this just enables them to also be more successful in their other grant applications as well then once they've secured some funding from us. The second one is St Mary Magdalene's in Monknash, repair of the chancel roof. And So this is a partial repair of the roof, total project cost of just short of £43,000. And again, a number of grant applications and fundraising efforts. Requested £5,000, we're proposing to award the £5,000. But again, proposing to award that in principle, pending confirmation of the success of the other funding applications. So we've got the application for Lisbon, and this has been recommended by Cardiff Council. And this is fitting out a newly built church house. And this is a part of a larger scheme that's been ongoing for some time. And the recommendation would be to award £3,750 towards the total amount requested. Cowbridge Tennis has requested some funding towards improving the tennis facility, so a new floodlit tennis court, and they have received some other funding from the council itself, from the Strong Communities Fund, and also some Section 106 funding towards the scheme. And there are a couple of other applications that are included as well as part of the scheme, so a total project cost of £104,000. All those other applications have been approved, and we've been provided with evidence of those applications. So the proposal will be to award the £5,000 in full. St Lawrence at Lavenant Trust, so the restoration of the church, and total project cost of a slightly smaller scheme of £7,295. They have received some funds already, and so we're proposing to award £4,380 towards that scheme. And then finally, we have something towards Churchyard Maintenance. So we were contacted by the organisation. They wanted something for to support ongoing church maintenance, but we did advise them that we only fund one-off schemes, and it's on that basis that they've requested funding towards an initial clearance of the overgrown churchyard. I'm looking to fund a working group going forward to help maintain the area. So the total project cost is £2,280, and we will be looking to award £1,710 towards that application, that scheme. Included in the report is a summary of the premises on which we can make grant awards, and the full detail is in the scheme of the trust, which you'll have seen under the previous item. And then Appendix C, we set out the kind of income and expenditure from the previous financial year. You will have received an updated Appendix C because there was the same typing error in terms of the grant allocation amount being 45,250 in year, not 45,520 in year. And so there's slightly reduced amount remaining then to be allocated in year, but it sets out some indicative figures. Now, we have talked as part of the items about potentially a larger scheme, but as you'll be aware, we also have some reserves, some unrestricted reserves for the committee, which we would be able to draw down on, and those are about 113,000 at the end of last financial year. So it could be that if we need to utilise some funds to progress any larger schemes, that we would be able to draw down on those as well.
Thank you.
So that was all I was going to pick up, but happy to answer any questions.
Mark, do you want to say something?
Yeah, two things. I'm just wondering, Gemma, on the ones that are agreed in principle, how long have they got to spend before you give them the money, and could it transfer over financial years, because fundraising can be tricky sometimes? So that's the first one.
Typically they do, actually, yes. So we normally give them about 3 years, and then if we haven't had any, we would contact the organisation. We usually try and stay in touch in the interim, but we would try and contact the organisation just to get a position either way. And we have historically then released those funds back into the grant pot to be allocated if they haven't been drawn down by then.
Okay, thank you. And the second point is just an observation. The Cardiff grant applicant didn't seem to be aware of the 75% limit for the grant, and I just wonder whether that's a point that they're aware of when the officers are speaking to applicants, because it helps people, doesn't it, if they're fully aware of what's going on.
They certainly have been aware of that in the past, but it might be that it was missed out this time. So we'll certainly get back in touch with the officers in Cardiff and make sure that they're aware of it going forward.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. Charles.
Quick question. When were these sort of applications actually, when do they come in? Because there's 24K now, and that's 22, 23 until obviously next April time. And you said you got some more in the pipeline. Do they all come at the beginning of the year because they know there's money being allocated? How does it work on an annual basis?
Well, we did actually run out of money last year, so we didn't have. So historically, we've had 3 tranches, but last year we only had 5,000 left at the time that we did the October tranche. So some of these applications contacted us shortly after that tranche, and so have been around for some time, which is why we've got such a large amount to award now. Typically, we do tend to get the majority of the applications in the early part of the year. So we usually have 3 tranches a year, but that 3rd tranche will be dependent on how many funds are, how much funds are remaining. So usually 1 in June, 1 in October, and then we pick up any balances in the January then if we've got sufficient funds to allocate. But those tranches are typically deferred until the following year.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Charles. Anyone got any other comments to make? If not, I'm happy to move that we recommend those grant applications. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Charles. Everyone else in agreement? Fine, thank you very much. Okay. All right, then moving on. I don't have anything else, which is urgent under part 1. We haven't moved part 2. Can I thank you all for coming to this meeting of the first Welsh Church of the new council, and I believe the next meeting I think is in the autumn. So I thank you all. Bye bye. Take care.
Cheers,
thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.